All right, that's dandy.
All right. Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Navakavada and all the ships at sea. Flash, we go to news. Today on Navakavada.org, we once more have Pannobhasa, formerly Bhikkhu, but now layman, who is going to be talking with us today about a subject I've been thinking about for quite a while. And that is the fact that the Sangha, of course, the Buddhist Sangha, exemplifies skillfulness, or at least in theory it does. The Buddha wants his monks to be very skillful, to practice ahimsa, non-harm, certainly not to kill animals and eat them. And yet at the same time, a Buddhist monk, as I understand it, is not supposed to refuse anything offered to him, and of course is not required to refrain from eating meat, something that does confuse some Westerners. But as I understand the concept of karma, the karma is created by your intention. And if you don't intend to go out and actually kill a squirrel and then cook it and eat it, there's no bad karma basically in eating an animal that someone else killed, so long as it was not killed specifically for you. Now, this to me, I suddenly started thinking about this, and I'm hoping Pannobhasa can give us some information on how this has been dealt with by Buddhism and Buddhist thought in the past. But it seems to me that the existence of the Sangha is to a certain extent dependent upon a laity which is not going to be following the Dharma all that well. So that, in order, the monks cannot kill animals and eat them, but they certainly can be fed by others who are killing animals and probably wouldn't be able to be fed without that, especially in countries like Tibet, although that's, another story entirely. So Pannobhasa, I wonder if you could give us an idea of what the Buddhist take is on this situation. If it's even been talked about at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, a monk is not only not allowed to kill animals, he's not even allowed to damage plants.
No.
Yeah, so even just being a vegetarian, if he's collecting his own food, it's still a no-no.
Wow.
The closest thing to an exception on that would be during times of famine, when the monks aren't getting enough food, they're allowed to pick up fruit that has fallen naturally from trees and eat without it being offered. But yeah, it's like they're not even allowed to damage plants, which guarantees that they are required to depend upon lay people. It's specifically designed that monks aren't allowed to cook their own food. They're not allowed to store food overnight. If they're going to get any food at all, it has to be given to them by someone who isn't a monk on the morning that they eat it. So there is that. But with regard to what you're talking about with monks relying upon sort of the immorality of lay people, that the monks are trying to be moral, but they have to, it practically necessitates immorality of the people that are supporting them. And probably the obvious explanation for at least a part of the explanation is that, I mean, the lay people are not going to be perfectly moral anyway. They're just not ready for that. A lot of them are, I mean, especially in the Buddhist time, were like farmers and so forth, that, they were just going to do what they were going to do. And the monk, like there's a verse in the Dhammapada saying that a good monk is like a bee that it goes from flower to flower without causing any hardship or damage to each flower. And so a monk going for alms through the village with his bowl, he just takes a little bit from each person and it causes no hardship to anybody. And so, I mean, he's just like a commensal organism in a way, where not really a parasite so much, because people are happy to give. It's all voluntary, and they're earning merit and so forth. So I guess you call it like a mutualistic relationship where both sides are benefiting. But still, the lay people, they're just never going to be saintly. I mean, most people just are not ready to renounce the world and live the life of some saintly, holy person. Like even having sex and so forth. I mean, you can argue that if everybody became a monk or a nun, then the human race would die out in one generation. But I mean, it's just never going to happen that even the majority of people are going to be ready and willing to renounce the world and become celibate and not even damage plants and so forth. So in a way, the monks are relying upon immoral people who aren't as moral as the monks in most cases. I mean, we can get to that too, but I mean, the lay people are going to be that way anyway. In a way, right. They're more moral because of the monks, just because they're keeping precepts and so forth. But I think the monks aren't really causing them to kill anything. Like you said, a monk he's allowed to eat meat, but he's not allowed to ask for it unless he's been given permission ahead of time, or he's sick or something like that.
Right.
And he's not allowed to eat anything that was killed for his sake. And so some of the monks in Burma, some of the stricter ones, will refuse to attend festivals because they know that on a festival day, animals are slaughtered, to feed to the monks' festival, and so they'll just refuse to go.
Oh wow! That's an interesting interpretation, because I always understood that it had to do with the individual monk rather than monks in general.
Well, it's kind of ambiguous there, but still, I mean, if they're killing the animals for the Sangha, then a member of the Sangha would not be allowed to eat it. If he sees, hears, or suspects that it was killed for his sake or for monk's sake in general.
So it's a stricter, basically someone being a little stricter within his interpretation.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting too, when you were describing this, and it hadn't really struck me before, but this does, as you say, force monks to be completely dependent upon the laity. And, I kind of see this as a way of guaranteeing that the monks won't lose touch with the laity. I mean, after all, if monks could, break the earth, engage in horticulture and agriculture and stuff, there would probably be a tendency just to leave the rest of the world entirely, and you'd never give lay people the benefit of Buddhism.
To some degree, although, I mean, they had to do that in China. When Buddhism went to China, the Chinese did not have the same reverence for like renunciant beggars as they had in India. So they had to become farmers essentially, but they're vegetarian. They didn't slaughter animals and that sort of thing.
Right. Well, that's always been the case. That's sort of what you found yourself when you tried to exist as a traditional monk in the West. It's just in a country that doesn't have the traditions behind it. You don't have the kind of support that the Sangha really needs, skillful or not. So it sounds like when the Buddha looks at society, and you're right, I mean, most people are going to continue, living the way they do. They're not going to suddenly become very saintly anytime soon. So it's almost like this engine of, destruction, whatever it is, all this activity, the samsara that people are engaging in, is happening anyway. So the Buddha found a way to sort of take some of it and direct it towards something that at least will help end samsara for some people.
Yeah, I mean, he's designed it in a way that would be helpful for lay people, even though they weren't really ready to like strive for enlightenment, that sort of thing. And as a general rule, the way it started was that, I mean, the lay meals just for the monks were just getting leftovers. And like some of the Jains and like the Ajiva in India, it was against the rules for them to eat anything that was specifically prepared for them, because that was generating karma of some sort. And so And they weren't even allowed to, like, if there was a hungry dog sitting around or lots of flies, they weren't allowed to accept food there because they'd be depriving the dog or the flies of a meal.
Oh
So that
my.
was creating so there were some sects that were more strict than the Buddhists, where they were just as completely unobtrusive and causing as few ripples or waves of any kind of effects as they possibly could, because they had a more mechanistic view of karma. They didn't see it so much as mental states as just sort of, worldly effects, almost like a material substance kind of a thing.
Wow. I gotta when you mentioned the rule about not eating anything except like in times of famine, fruit that had already fallen off a tree, that kind of that's had a Jain feel to it. Excuse me, when you said that, don't they have a kind of a similar rule for like every day where things have to where they can eat fruit, but it has to be like even rotting or something?
I think it was some of the Brahmins, like
Oh,
the Jatilas, they were called, the matted hair ascetics, who were
oh,
the fire worshippers in the forest, that some of them, it was allowable for them to just eat food that had, like, fruit that had fallen off of trees, that sort of thing.
interesting. You know, as you probably are aware, in the Bible they talk about having a jubilee year, in which no one would be allowed to sow, no one would be allowed to slaughter animals or anything. And in theory, they were supposed to just eat the food right off of let the grain like grow up wild in the fields.
Yeah.
And
So they just deliberately be real sloppy in collecting the grain the year before, I think.
yeah,
Just
yeah.
a lot of it would spontaneously germinate and grow into new wheat or whatever.
What's interesting, there's no evidence that a jubilee year was ever celebrated. It was a completely theological artifact. I
Really?
don't. Yeah, I remember reading that some. I mean, I could do a little more. This wasn't the topic of conversation. I didn't do a lot of research on it, but the last I knew, there's no evidence that any sort of a jubilee year was ever held. Because if you think about it, it would be insane. No, the whole country stopping doing everything. It's like you were talking about, if everybody suddenly became a monk or a nun. Not only would we'd all die off, but I mean, 90% of us would starve to death. Nobody could engage in agriculture anymore. All the poor animals in the zoos and the field, they'd just be let go, and what would happen to them? So, it'd be a big mess. So I think the Buddha was very correct in seeing that this was always going to be a path for the minority. And
and then, because it was a path for the minority, the lay people were sort of they were sort of like the base camp for the people trying to get to the top of the mountain.
Right.
And they earn merit through supporting the monks who are really going for full enlightenment. And that sort of thing just falls through in the West as a general rule. I mean, there's gradually being more support for, like, Theravada Buddhist monasticism in the West. But in general, America is egalitarian, and they really do not like having, the lay people just being the supporters of the heavy hitters who are really trying to do it. Like in the East, it's Theravada Buddhism is like a spectator sport. You're supporting your favorite team, but they don't have any unrealistic notions that they're going to become enlightened. Whereas in the West, it's a lot of some Western Buddhists are actually, like, offended by the very existence of a ordained Sangha, because it somehow makes their own lukewarmness seem not good enough somehow.
Yeah. Well, I guess some people they don't like the idea of an actual spiritual elite.
Yeah.
It's
like a class system or something. Some people are higher than others, and that is, like, verboten in a culture like the USA, to the extent that the USA has a culture still.
And yet it seems to me, and I think most people would think about it, that hierarchies are biologically, I mean, they're an intrinsic part of the way we're put together, if nothing else. And I was discussing this with someone else not long ago. We're talking about society. And you get some of these guys, I don't know, you go to some of these hard left Marxist websites and they talk about, we can have a completely non-hierarchical society. And it's like, first of all, society is based on family unit. Mother, father, child, that is society in a nutshell. And you're going to have a hierarchy there. A child needs mommy and daddy to tell them what to do. You can't get away from the fact that some people are going to be operating at different levels than others. But I think people get angry at that because, it's
like these same communistic people, they consider meritocracy to be some kind of abomination. Whereas it just makes sense that the people who are the most qualified are going
Yeah.
to rise to the top in that field. And it's like having everybody forced to be equal,
Yeah.
it's just not going to work. It's in violation of just nature, really.
I don't know how they slip that through. I mean, the idea of political equality, well, that's one thing. Obviously, everybody should, at least it seems to me as an American, everyone should be equal before the law. But now it's
Equal
meant,
rights, equal opportunities.
right, but not making everyone identical. Trying to fit everyone into
Yeah.
a mold. That's like shades of Plato kind of stuff. It's
Yeah, the
just
hard left. I mean, it's like they can't tell the difference between equality and sameness, or equality. Yeah, just equality and sameness.
yeah, yeah. I don't know. I think we're losing a lot of the language. There's a lot less nuance in our language. I think it's part of the dumbing down process. Every time you take a word and take away that word's original nuanced meaning, you're losing a little something in your ability to describe what's going on. And that's part of the thing where they censor speech. Well, you're not allowed to say this word. You're not allowed to say that word. Well, what word am I supposed to say? And it's just it's an insidious process, really, an insidious process. But we're getting a little far afield. Now, another aspect I wanted to talk about with the Sangha, depending upon the laity for its existence, is the fact that, as we were just saying, unless Buddhism exists in a Buddhist country, it simply cannot prosper. And we lost your picture there. Are you there? Lost you.
Yeah, you froze. I've been hearing you fine.
Oh, okay.
You became motionless for a few seconds.
Okay. Well, anyway, for Buddhism to prosper, in any sense of the word, it needs to exist in a Buddhist country. Buddhism is a very delicate, very, very vulnerable thing, as we discovered when we look at the history of the Muslim invasions of northern India. I don't know how many millions of Buddhists were killed, but it must have seemed like a field day, for the Muslims coming in and look, here are these temples full of gold and books. And I don't know if they were interested in the books so much. And a bunch of guys that weren't allowed to exist.
History.
What's that?
I think the slaughter of the Buddhists in India at the hands of the Muslim Turks was one of the greatest genocides in history. It was well up into tens of millions.
Yeah, yeah. And so that obviously shows that for the Sangha to it needs to have a certain amount of protection from things like that. And we have seen some Buddhist countries in Southeast Asia where the people there recognize this and have taken steps to keep their countries Buddhist. And I mean, of course, this is nothing new. If you know the history of the, I think his name was Young Husband's expedition up into Tibet, another Buddhist country, Buddhism of a sort anyway. And they were very, very against any kind of Westerners coming because they wanted to defend their Buddhism. And they saw, and probably quite rightly, that too many foreigners, especially powerful foreigners coming in with another religion, would be in a way marginalize the Buddhism that they've been following for so many centuries. Would you care to comment a little about that? What should be the Sangha's attitude toward protecting the Dhamma by the lay people?
Well, I don't think that, Buddhism can prosper only in a Buddhist culture, a specifically Buddhist culture. Like Buddhism arose in a non-Buddhist culture, and then it took root and then grew and prospered. But it has to be like a dharmic culture, like a tolerant dharmic kind of culture. And it, in a way, ancient India in the Buddhist time was almost ideal. And then not only in the Buddhist time, but up until the Muslims,
Right.
took over most of the subcontinent. You had different sects of Buddhism, and also like Buddhism and Jainism and the various schools of proto-Hinduism. There were like peacefully debating and like strengthening their arguments, strengthening their system, like because you had other people who were like rationally like picking out the faults of your system,
Right,
and
right.
it was like strength. It was almost like a Darwinian evolution of spirituality, and in a way that's better than a monoculture, because in a monoculture it's like a monopoly. You have a monopoly on some commodity, then the price goes up and the quality goes down, and there's nothing anybody can do about it, especially if it's something that's considered necessary.
Right.
But if you've got different competing forms of the same commodity, like in this case, like a spiritual system, then in a way, I mean, it's actually helpful, but there has to be tolerance of other points of view. You know, that's like the Abrahamic religions are notorious for being intolerant.
Yes, yes.
You know, it's like, if you don't believe us, you're a heretic and you're going to hell, and we're going to speed you along your way to hell by, you know, some crusade or whatever.
Right, right. Well, that is typical of those religious traditions, and I remember reading about the idea of the world religion, because up until the time of the the Abraham, especially Christianity and Islam, most religions were basically what you were born into. The religion was a local thing, a local god, even the household gods, and you had, well, I accept the ideas of Russell Gmerkin, who says that the modern version of Judaism was specifically engineered, based on Plato's ideas, the Republic and other works, his laws, to create a state, a society, which would be very strong and unified. And then Christianity took these ideas and included, forcible or otherwise conversion. And then, of course, Islam, we all know about Islam. So I think that this was a deliberate moving away from the sort of tolerance you're talking about, because now, you mentioned it, it's like, yeah, I don't think, setting up a Buddhist monastery in, like, I don't know, late imperial Roman times in Europe would have been a bad thing. I mean, well, pre-Christian, obviously.
Yeah.
But, later on, it would have been very, very difficult. And even at a time when, even into the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were a lot of misunderstandings. I was reading some of Ananda Mataya's very verbose writings on Buddhism. He's one of the earliest English Buddhists, and Aleister Crowley's buddy there. And he spent a lot of his time explaining that Buddhism was not devil worship. Buddhism was not idolatry. Buddhism was not witchcraft. There are no human sacrifices involved. And this is to, like, an Edwardian audience. You'd think they would know better by then. But just there's always been a lot of cultural inertia to allowing anyone else to practice something, which in India, though, that was a very unique time. It would be great to get a time machine and go back there, just check it out.
Well, even like pre-Christian Rome was fairly similar, where you had the state religion, but there were many gods. You could be a votary of Apollo or a votary of Juno or whatever. And then there was like the foreign cults,
yes,
ISIS
and all that. Yeah, Cybele
cults, Orphism and
ISIS,
they all got along together fairly well. You had the votaries of Cybele, the guys who would castrate themselves and all that, and it was fairly tolerant. I mean, every once in a while the Senate would crack down on Dionysus worship or Isis worship in the area of Rome or something, but
that, I think, had to do more with public order. Nothing like having a couple of thousand people getting drunk for a couple of days out.
There's also, you're mentioning the Jews. That's one reason why the Romans were more tolerant of the Jews, except for when they started getting really violent.
Right.
Than they were of the Christians, is because for the Jews, they were born into the religion as a general rule. It was just seen as, they're following their ancient traditions and so forth. Whereas the Christians, at first, were just all new converts to this weird superstition, and it was seen as just very different. They were less tolerant of the Christians, except, of course, when the Jews were going on rampages and insisting that they weren't subservient to Rome anymore and so forth.
Right. Yeah. Well, Judaism, whatever we say about it, is part of that continuum of religious thought in that, the eastern end of the Mediterranean region. So for the Romans, it wouldn't have been as odd. I mean, even the the whole temple in Jerusalem, to me, that always seemed to be basically an echo of every city in the Levant and in the Mesopotamia and in the Near East and Middle East usually had a god that owned it. So in a sense, Jerusalem was like one of the last, you got the temple, and the city really belongs to the god, and the king and the government are basically servants of the god. This dates back to the bicameral times. How did Julian Jaynes get in there? When they would literally hear the idols speaking, and what we translate as king in a lot of the old Mesopotamian records was actually overseer or straw boss for the god. Of course, it's always a great job when the boss never shows up and never checks the books. Oh yeah, I work for God. Oh, I know it's a terrible thing I have to do, but I've got orders. It's not my choice. So, but yeah, so I think it would have been a much more natural thing for the Romans to deal with than, as you point out, these guys coming up with basically a new cult, which had so many different variations in it before they, started all the heresy hunting and stuff and unified Christianity. There were some very odd variations on it, some of which may very well have included human sacrifice. I mean, people did it back then; they still do. And so, yeah, that was a very interesting time, though, in India, like you're saying. But so, all right, well, perhaps not a definitively Buddhist culture is necessary for Buddhism, but still, it needs a place where it is at least tolerated. But also, though, where people will culturally accept the idea of monks going on alms rounds. Like you point out, in China, monks had to start engaging in agriculture and stuff like that, because I'm sure the first time a line of monks came out with begging bowls, the Chinese villagers said, well, go get a job or something. It wasn't part of the culture. So, and this, of course, is part of the modifications of Buddhism. I remember, and in Tibet, it modified even further, in part, no doubt, to the extremes of the climate there. But also, I think the long tradition that people had there with what, for want of a better word, would be shamanic types of mysticism and spirituality. So,
and just out sorcery, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And of course, sorcery is one of those things. Again, it's in every culture, and there is that saying, what is it? Private religion is magic, public magic is religion, sort of thing. So there's always a fine line between, performing a magical ritual and performing a religious ritual. I think that line kind of got like completely eliminated in a lot of Tibetan Buddhism. But although I was listening to a lecture where they were talking about the tantric Buddhism that was recorded by the Dutch when they were first spending time in Southeast Asia, and these monks were telling them things like, we do this meditation when the moon is in this phase and the sun is in this, and it's all this. But one of them I thought was that they would make offerings to jhana, so that jhana would come and dwell in them. They're like actually asking for jhana, rather than actually practicing meditation or anything like that. So it can change. But still, is there any discussion, though, or talk in the Sangha about the idea of protecting the Sangha? Because we've seen that in Burma, where you were. There was some, I don't know if we can talk, how openly we can talk about this on YouTube. What about the Rohingya?
Oh, yeah, that was just the idea of, a certain group of like very conservative monks and, their lay supporters just wanted to keep Burma Buddhist and Burmese. And so, of course, they were intolerant of, especially Muslims. They're much more tolerant of Christians. There's quite a few Christians in Burma also. But Islam has acquired a certain stereotype or reputation. There's a belief in among the Burmese Buddhists, a lot of them, out in the villages, that if you have a few Muslims in the village, it's not bad. They make good neighbors, and also it's handy to have a village Muslim to be the butcher, because of course it's not so good for a Buddhist to be a pork butcher or something. Right. So, but then if they reach a certain critical mass, then they start becoming intolerant. And that's what bothers these sort of Buddhists in Burma, who really do not want a lot of Muslims immigrating into Burma.
Right. How much of an influence were these monks and lay supporters? We hear all sorts of sensationalized stories in the West, but it seems to be like simply a small group of people expressing their concerns about this. How could that really make a problem?
Well, to some degree, it sort of fans the flames in areas where there is a large Muslim population. Although the Rohingyas, it's my understanding that most of them just left the country and don't want to come back. You've got NGOs that are trying to pressure the Burmese into taking the Rohingya back, but the Rohingyas don't even want to come back. They prefer to stay in Bangladesh or something. But also, a lot of the government, which is largely a military government still, they kind of agree that they don't want the Rohingyas either. And
Right.
the Rohingyas were invited into Burma by the British. And so, I mean, during British colonial times,
Right.
British, I mean, in British colonial times, in the early parts of it, the whole Irrawaddy Delta was just like jungle. It hadn't been cleared, and usually river deltas tend to be very fertile, and
Right.
the British realized this and they had it cleared. They needed farmers, so they just brought in a bunch of Muslims from India and settled.
Oh,
And so the Burmese just, I mean, they never considered them to be Burmese to begin with. They were just brought there by the colonialists and so forth.
right. Right.
Yeah, so it was they're always sort of seen as non-Burmese sort of intruders or something, at least by a substantial fraction of the Burmese population. But I was gonna, yeah, I can't remember what I was gonna talk about. There was something, I had this connection in my head, but yeah, the technical difficulties kind of derailed it, I think.
Yeah. Well, it might come back to you. Things seem to have calmed down here a bit. The rain stopped too. I don't know if that's related, but now I knew the British had brought them in, and of course the British were famous for, and they took this from the Romans and from the Mesopotamians before them, the Sumerians and the Akkadians, and so forth, of divide and conquer. You take conquered peoples and you move them around, make a hodgepodge. I forget, was it Ariel Sharon who said we're going to make a salami sandwich out of the Palestinians? You just do the Jewish settlements and you just break them up by adding other people. So I can see the British having that in their mind.
Yeah, they definitely did that in Burma.
But,
definitely.
But it sounds like not only were the native Burmese not accepting of the forced immigrants or the immigrants, but the Rohingya themselves don't feel like they're particularly Burmese then. I mean, do they?
I really can't say what their attitude is because I've never really. I mean, I've met the occasional village Muslim in in Upper Burma and so forth, but I never really even went to Rakhine State, which is where the Rohingya situation was. So I've never really dealt with them much.
But well, it sounds like that they have managed to have a solution to the Rohingya problem then, if they just basically left.
Yeah, although of course the NGOs, the United Nations and so forth, are trying to get them to go back, but I don't think either side really is keen on the idea.
Yeah, it's always interesting when they try to force people to do things that nobody wants to do. Please move back here. We don't want to, and we don't want them. It's like everybody's happier this way, it seems like. So
yeah. So there's one thing that, I mean, when you told me you wanted to do a video about like monk virtue versus like lay people virtue.
Well, the idea, yeah.
So it's like one thing that just came to my mind immediately is that let's see, how do I put this? Oh yeah, it's a phenomenon I observed in Burma, is that the places where the monks are the most lax are generally where the lay people are most devout. So the better the lay people, the worse the monks. As a general rule, they're like in Burma, it's just this phenomenon that the strictest monks, and the reason for that is that the really devout lay people, they're going to support monks no matter what. It's just kind of the skeptical ones, the ones that are like discriminate and will disapprove of a monk, that if he's really obviously lax, then the monks have to be better in order to get support. So in a way, that's good for like non-Buddhist cultures where monasticism is trying to or Buddhist monasticism is trying to take root. That like a lot of the Asian temples, the monks are just following Asian traditions and not really following the rules of monastic discipline all that much. And the Westerners really don't have much interest in that. But some of the Western monks, the Ajahn Chah tradition, for example, the Western aspect of the Ajahn Chah tradition, those monks tend to be relatively very strict. And so they get more respect and support, I think, from non-Asian, like not just immigrants, but from the native population, so to speak.
Right. So they like to see them walking the walk as well as talking the talk.
Yeah.
Do you
Oh
think that's
yeah, that reminded me of what you asked me this question before about, how do the Buddhists try to preserve their traditions and so forth. And I think the main way that they're trying to do it, like in Sri Lanka as well as Burma, is by like preserving the texts. Like in Sri Lanka, it's a common belief even among the monks that it's not possible to become an arahant anymore. It's not possible to become enlightened anymore. We're too much in the Kali Yuga, and
right?
so all they can really do is just preserve the text and preserve the tradition, for in case there is like a resurgence, like a spiritual resurgence, then the text will be there that can actually be followed to completion. And in Burma, they have a belief that when Buddhism dies, it's going to die in reverse order of the existence of the Tipitaka. So I
Oh,
mean, the very first part of the Tipitaka is the rules of monastic discipline. The Vinaya Pitaka is the first Pitaka. So that's something that people don't really relate too much in the West, where it's considered to be the heart of the religion is the monastic rules for monks and nuns, you know. So and then the last is the Abhidhamma, and the
right.
last book or books of the Abhidhamma is called Patana. And so in Burma, they have what are called patanpoes, where they've got monks reciting patana over loudspeakers, sometimes 24/7 for a week
Wow.
straight. That,
Wow.
because that's going to be the first text that goes extinct when Buddhism is dying.
Oh.
So they're making sure that one is rock solid. But meanwhile, I mean, it's just sort of a traditional belief. And meanwhile, probably less than 2% of the monks are really trying to follow the rules of monastic discipline correctly. The book is there, but the practice isn't there for most monks anymore. But it may have been that way for 2,000 years or more.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but as you point out, though, some of the Western monks are much stricter. And
Yeah,
as what you say, it seems to be fueled in part by our Western attitude. We do have, not all of us, but we do have this thing that the messenger should be something in line with the message. In other words, you want somebody who's teaching you the Dharma to also obviously be practicing it and not
yeah,
be there sipping a glass of wine and, well, I got to hurry up because my girlfriend's waiting for me, but I'll give a quick Dharma talk kind of deal.
yeah. Well, I think the main reason is why, for example, one of the litmus tests for whether a monk is strict or not is whether he handles money or not.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe 2% of Southeast Asian monks don't handle money. It's a small percentage of monks that actually won't handle money. Whereas with Western monks, it might be more than half Western monks don't handle money.
Wow.
So I mean, it's significantly, by an order of magnitude, more Western monks will be strict in following the rules than Asian monks. And one of the reasons for that is because a Western monk isn't just following his tradition. He's got to make a break with his culture. I mean, possibly estranging his friends and his family. So he's real serious. He's doing it because he wants to become enlightened, not just because he wants a free monastic education or
Right.
higher social status or whatever.
Right. Right. Right.
So
Well,
they have to be more serious because they really have to renounce more in order to become a monk. Whereas a lot of Burmese or Asian monks, they enter the monastery when they're kids. The family's got too many mouths to feed. They want the merit and like the social status of having a monk in the family, and so they'll
yeah.
just send one of their kids to the monastery.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've spoken about that before. When you're describing this about the Western, the new converts, the Western monks, it does kind of remind me of the, like the gatekeeper process, where if you want to see the guy up on the mountaintop, you've got to climb through the brush and this and that. Basically, only people that are really serious are going to try to do this. And we have spoken before about the fact that, there are aspects of Buddhism in the East, where, as you say, it's just old traditions. This is where you send a kid that you can't feed. I guess we've also talked about it can be a good retirement plan for countries without Social Security. If you're getting on in years, join the monastery. At least you're going to get 1 square meal a day, and depending on the country, you're in cheese in the afternoon, and you'll be able to basically it's been integrated into aspects of the culture that have little or nothing to do with spiritual enlightenment. Whereas here, and as we spoke before, Buddhism simply isn't integrated into the culture. People have very different expectations of it. And I guess in Southeast Asia, no one would be surprised to see a time-serving monk, just a guy there for the food. Here we would tend to, I think, an American would tend to be a little more shocked at that. So maybe this is a way of revitalizing the Dharma a little bit, or at least the practice of the Dharma.
Yeah, although it's definitely going to mutate pretty radically when it enters a radically different culture. Any time Buddhism, comes into a new culture, it mutates. So you've got, Japanese Buddhism is very different from Indian Buddhism. It's even different from Chinese or Korean Buddhism. So it's obviously there's going to be Western culture is going to be, influencing any kind of Theravada Buddhism that really takes hold. And that can be a good thing or a bad one. Usually it's both to some degree.
Well, yeah, we brought up Tibetan Buddhism, which is a very, the more you learn about the Vinyan, the original ideas beyond Theravada, the more bizarre some of the aspects of Tibetan Buddhism can seem. My old joke about getting the Buddha in a time machine and bringing him, into the future where you can see a guy wearing this wacky hat with a human thigh bone trumpet and a skull to drink wine out of. Say that's a Buddhist monk. Who also has a small army of his own, and he might find that a little on the odd side. And actually, while we're talking about Tibetan Buddhism, should we talk about the Dalai Lama and his latest little escapade?
Yeah, his Biden moment.
Well, and I haven't seen anyone else talking about this. I don't know how much you know about Tibetan culture. I'm no expert, certainly, but sticking your tongue out is a traditional Tibetan greeting.
Yeah.
And so. And it's a kid playing around. I don't know. I kind of really think it's just basically a semi-senile old guy being harmless.
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, if it were more than that, if he really were some sort of pedophile or sexual predator, there probably would have been a lot of Me Too allegations just coming to the surface. Like when Sai Baba was outed for touching inappropriately teenage boys. You had all these Me Too's. Yeah, he did that to me too when I was a boy, and it didn't happen with the Dalai Lama. Or at least I'm not aware of it. So I think probably, he stuck his tongue out, which was like a Tibetan cultural thing, and then because he's talking to a kid, he's kind of in the child humor kind of a thing, and he just makes a joke that bombed.
Yeah. And I think he's being very wise about just not saying anything. I think there's been he just said he regretted it, and otherwise there's been no comment. But if he was really up to that sort of thing, I think we would have heard about it a lot sooner. He does have a lot of enemies, especially from the the PRC, and they would be quick to spread that sort of thing all over the place. Also, I'm not an expert again on this, but I believe I remember reading somewhere that he is a tantric initiate in several things. So it's not like, as far as I know, he's a Yab Yum initiate. They don't talk about this much because Westerners, will get a very twisted idea of it. So it's not like he's deprived. Let's put it that way. I don't think that, as far as that sort of thing goes. But because the minute I heard the tongue sticking out, I'm like, well, they all do that. You've probably seen dozens of images of that. Very traditional there. So
it's even that Brad Pitt movie 7 Years in Tibet.
I didn't see that.
No, I haven't seen it either, but I've been told that the tongue sticking out is even in the movie, whereas it's just a Tibetan traditional thing.
Yeah. So
there's one other thing, since we're talking about monastic virtue and lay virtue. We started off talking about how monks are actually to some degree capitalizing on the fact that most people just aren't going to be saints. They just don't even want to be saints. But just traditionally in Theravada, there's just two different sets of virtue. There's two different paths, one for the monastic and one, or the renunciant, and one for the layperson, because the layperson is just trying to get a better birth. As a general rule, in the West, it might be different. People want to become enlightened, like Eckhart Tolle or something. But traditionally in the East, a layperson, they're just earning merit. They're getting good karma in order to get a better setup. If they don't go to heaven, at least they're going to be rich and beautiful and healthy in their next life as a human. Whereas the monastics or the renunciants, they're trying to transcend good and evil. They're not trying to get any kind of karma. They're not trying to get any kind of merit. They're not trying to accumulate anything. They're just
Right.
trying to get out. They're trying to get out of samsara, to just transcend the whole thing. And so for a monk, ultimately, they're just trying to be like lawful neutral, using Dungeons and Dragons terminology. They're not trying to do good or bad.
Right.
It's like Mara, the Buddhist devil, so-called.
Right.
If he can't get you to be bad, he'll get you to be good, because either way you're earning karma, or you're earning merit or demerit. You're still generating karma, and you're still stuck in the system.
Right.
So it's like two entirely different systems, which again in the West doesn't go over very well, because it's egalitarian and everyone should have the same set of values and so forth.
They'll start calling it apartheid or something.
Yeah.
Bhikkhus only. Well, there is that, because when I stayed with you with the monastery, there's a bathroom that only the bhikkhus could use, as I recall, or maybe that you just want me to use it. But no, so again, it comes down to people being afraid of a spiritual hierarchy. And yet, by definition, of course, you're going to have a hierarchy when it comes to spirituality. You're going to have people who are more developed and who are, like you say, sprinting to the top, rather than just, I just want to get to the next base camp. I mean, I'll tell you the truth, I don't really think I'm going to be enlightened in this lifetime at this point. I mean, maybe it's possible, but I'm just hoping to get a decent rebirth where I can keep practicing. I mean, I realize I'm on a long, slow road. And I remember a quote, what was it? Something about the practice for some people is pleasurable and swift, and for other people it's difficult and long. And well, the people for whom it's pleasurable and swift, they're all gone. They've all made it already. So
unless they just started. Yeah.
Oh, there is that. I hadn't thought of that part, but
yeah. Well, talking about spiritual hierarchies, then you read something like Rene Guénon, and he just says, I mean, there's no spirituality without a spiritual hierarchy. It's like you got to have the spiritual elite who are like channeling heavenly wisdom down. They're like the receivers. Most people just are too opaque to be a receiver of like heavenly wisdom from above. So you got the spiritual elite who are like the antennas. They're just receiving the wisdom from above so that they can spread it to some degree among the low masses.
Yeah. Well, he was coming out of a 19th century occult tradition that was very much like that. And everything from occult Templarism to, weird extraneous masonry. And of course, all of that came out of the monarchical era. A lot of it was in a reaction to the French Revolution. But I think that we had that in the West for a long time too. I think it's really the French Revolution, the American Revolution a little bit, but mostly the French Revolution that spread these egalitarian ideas and made them so unpopular today.
Yeah, I think it was Oswald Spengler who said that the French Revolution was the beginning of the decline of Western civilization.
Yeah, I can understand why he would say that. Yeah, I can understand why he would say that. Yeah. No, it's interesting because we've changed our way of looking at these things so radically, and yet it's also very recent. And it's, I don't think it, it doesn't go down all to the way to the bone. It does to a point. I mean, there's things that make us angry about, like we were talking about. They don't like a spiritual hierarchy. How come that guy is more important than me just because he's been a renunciate out in the forest for like 27 years? And hey, I didn't drink any beer yesterday. Doesn't that give me, I should be going to Nirvana too, kind of deal. But at the same time, I think we're fascinated with it. I was talking to someone earlier about the fact that Americans are fascinated. I don't know so much these days, but when I used to pay more attention to the mainstream media, they love to hear about the royals. Princess Diana was a huge thing. Prince, now King Charles, especially the British royals. And it's like, we're a country that was founded in part on the idea of kicking the British crown off of our territory and taking charge of ourselves. And I always like to go on about the fact, and very few people know this, although more know it because I talk about it a lot. On my state seal, I live in New York State. Under there, you've got the seal with the two supporters. One is the allegorical figure of liberty, and at her foot is the crown of the United Kingdom, which is she is the crown. Yeah, so we've got like the crown of the UK on the ground being trodden under by the foot of liberty. This was where we came from, and to this day, we are fascinated with hierarchies, with monarchs, with kings and queens. And people do really get a kick out of the incredibly hierarchical and ornate Baroque form of, again, Tibetan Buddhism. I don't know why I'm bringing that up a lot. The hats. It's the hats. I got to have the hat.
Yeah.
But
The
yeah.
throat singing.
Mm-hmm. And and those skull goblets are just like, that's really metal. But yeah, no. People are fascinated with that, but then they want to instantly have the hat. Oh wow, this is good, and Rinpoche this, and all this structure. But wait, why aren't I sitting up there? It's kind of a weird. They like the imagery of it and the idea of it, but they don't understand the actual mechanism of it and how it works, and the fact that when you've got these hierarchies, by necessity, only a very tiny, small group is going to be able to attain through their merit to that peak.
Yeah, and it takes a lot of dedication and renunciation and hard work and self-discipline that the average person in the West they just don't have it.
Yeah.
They don't even want to do that. So they want to become enlightened just kind of accidentally, or like Eckhart Tolle again, Or I was told by one person who was they spent some time in Dharamsala teaching English to the Tibetan monks there. They had some experience. They said that what the average Westerner wants when he goes to see some guru or Rinpoche or something, what they want deep in their heart is for the guru to just look directly at them, point at them and say, "You are the chosen one." It's sort of like this Western narcissism where they want to just be the I don't know, just the one, like Neo. At first he doesn't even know that he's the one, but he gets singled out by Morpheus.
Right. Just by living my life fucked up the way I am, I was doing it right all the time. In other words, I can do these things without having to work at them.
Yeah.
Kind of deal. Yeah. It's interesting, but as you point out, there are people though that do take it very seriously, and particularly in the West. So, I'm hoping, agreeing that there are going to be modifications, and of course we've already seen those. But if we can keep the core of the Dhamma, pure, I think that, we can live with modifications. And you've even said, when we've talked about all the different forms of Buddhism, that there's more overlap really than difference. Even though Buddhism changes, or maybe you didn't say that, but I seem to recall we were talking once about, Vajrayana, Mahayana, Theravada.
Well, I think at the highest levels they converge. They may be radically different at the level of the illiterate villager, so to speak. But then the higher up you go, it's like not just Buddhism either, but any kind of spiritual tradition, the higher up you go, the more it's going to converge. So even like the teachings of St. John of the Cross or Meister Eckhart, they come closer to the advanced teachings of Buddhism or the Upanishads or something than they do to, what the average preacher is preaching in a church, in some Methodist church or Baptist or whatever, let alone a Jehovah's Witness temple.
Well, I remember, I think it was Alan Watts talking about a ecumenical conference he attended while he was still an Anglican priest, and he said, you'd get the bishops and the prelates, and they had some Buddhist clerics there, and they're all at all the top end guys are arguing about this terminology and how we translate this and that. And he said all the monks, the Orthodox and Catholic monks and the Buddhist monks, they would just nod to each other. They knew because they were pursuing the same basic experience deep down. They didn't need the arguments that the higher clerics needed to engage in order to reconcile.
Yeah, and the practices are very similar. It's just the theory differs, but the practice is very similar in a lot of respects. I was surprised when I was reading St. John of the Cross just how almost every element of Buddhist practice is also found in the practice of a discalced Carmelite monk.
Wow. Well, the human mind is the same in all times and places. It, varies in quality, but it's basically the same thing. And I guess whenever enlightened people are trying to describe the path, there are going to be similarities. We're all working with the same equipment, and if you're trying to get to the same place, I would imagine there's going to always be some overlap there.
Yeah, the practice is there's going to be much more overlap in the practice than in the theory, because I mean there's just radically different theories that Christianity is radically different from Theravada Buddhism.
Right.
Even though the
Well,
practice of the monks there's a lot of overlap, especially the contemplative orders where they're actually meditating and so forth.
yeah, what was that? No tongue has soiled it, no word has spoken it, or something like that.
No,
Just the
yeah,
whole, when you try to describe these experiences, you simply push them away. The
yeah.
more you
The
think
name
about
that
the
can be named is not the eternal name.
right, right, and the way that can be described is not the eternal way.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, we've been at this for more than an hour, it seems like. Did you have anything else you wanted to add? Anything else you wanted to talk about with this, or should we wrap it up?
With regard to the issue of monastic morality contrasted to lay morality, yeah, I pretty much had my say. I pointed out the weird, almost contradiction of, the stricter the lay people, the laxer the monks, and vice versa in Burma.
That's
At least in
interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah.
also how there's two different sets of morals, one for traditionally for the renunciants and one for the lay people. It's one is the path to heaven and the other is the path to just enlightenment and just completely transcending samsara. And what else? Yeah, I think I pretty much said what occurred to me to say.
Mm.
uh, yeah, you're the questioner, so
Well, I'm glad that you answered these questions, and it gave us something to think about. And for me, it was good that you reminded me about that fact that the way the Sangha is set up is so that it will be interacting with the laity all the time. I mean, so the monks couldn't just run off and start growing their own food. And it kind of helps integrate them into the culture more. Because I'm sure in India at that time, there were plenty of guys that are just running off into the woods and want nothing to do with the laity, so that the laity would get no benefit. And I've also read that an important part of having the Sangha be in contact with the laity is that they're supposed to provide a good example to them. Like you might not be able to do this right now. You're a householder, you've got this or that. You can't, but you can see that we're doing it. It's possible. And as you point out, you've got the laity, the householder morality, and which is based on the higher morality. I don't know higher, but perhaps a little more of it. Instead of 5 precepts or 8 precepts, was it 227 or something like that?
well, ultimately there's like 2 or 3 thousand rules
Wow.
altogether.
Wow.
227 is just the Patimokkha, but there's way
Oh,
more than that.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, you also said, I remember once that some of them, they're just basically impossible to keep because they don't apply anymore.
Well, I mean, they're not impossible to keep, they're largely impossible to break. I mean, there are some where they just never quite figured out that these two rules conflict with each other.
Hmm.
Like a monk isn't supposed to wear his upper robe when he goes into a bathroom because he's not supposed to be wearing his upper robe and get it dirty in an outhouse or whatever. But at the
Right.
same time, if he's in public, he's not allowed to take it off.
Oh,
So so it creates this, it's like you can't go to the bathroom in public kind of a thing. But I mean, you may not have any choice. I mean, when you got to go, you
right,
got to go.
right, right.
So there are little things like that, but as a general rule, a lot of the monks a lot of the rules are just designed for ancient India, and they just don't come up anymore. Like uh, giving food with your own hands to a naked ascetic and that kind of a thing. It's a Pachitya rule, a medium severity rule, but it just doesn't happen much anymore.
That's interesting that monks would give food to other people too. They don't just receive food.
Yeah, if you got more than you need or something, I
Huh.
guess. Yeah.
But if any skyclad Jains show up, it's like, sorry, pal.
Yeah.
Or with your own hands, you can put it down. It's like, sorry, let me put that down there. Okay.
You just let the attendant deal with it.
There you go. There you go. Cool. Well, thanks very much, Pannobhasa, for being here and talking with us again. It's always a pleasure to have you here on the show.
Hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, hopefully we'll be getting together again soon. I'm going to try to get a regular, we've been talking about building like a regular, consistent studio here. So we might be able to start setting up like a regular schedule of talks. I don't know, fortnightly or something like that or something. And Yeah, so hopefully we'll be having some more very interesting discussions soon. I do thank you very much for your insights today.
Yeah, well, I always enjoy these. This is good.
Really. All right. Well, good night, everybody. Thank you very much for watching, if you've watched this far. And to all of my friends and my admirable friend, I send metta, my friends, metta.
Yeah, meta and be happy.
That too.